Even if you're not on screen, we still see you, Niklaus and Abby and Taylor and Tina. Thank you for coming on screen, Brandon, John, and Drake, and all the people. Greg, Diana, Francisco, is that how you say your name? I'm so curious. And Susan and Larry, Val, good to see you all. Thank you for joining us today. Um, we are so blessed to have such wise souls sharing their hearts in the Soil Summit this year. And our next guest is a community soil scientist. She's a compost specialist and educator. She most recently just had a lot of her friends lose their homes and their gardens in the LA area with the fires. And so she's been working with them on soil remediation and looking at like what's going on and what their next steps are. And she's taking some time. She still made time to be here with us today. So we deeply appreciate that, Lynn. Thank you. Thank you. She also is an ecological landscaper, and she teaches and applies a whole systems approach to soil biology and soil health and composting and plant health. And today we're going to be taking a look at pest and disease control with microbiology, because she's kind of, I'll say, geeked out on it and looked into it and studied it and has some insights of what she's learned and what she'd like to share with us. And it's also an open conversation. So as you have questions that come up as we're having this conversation with Lynn, pop them into the chat so that we can get those questions answered. And I just want to say a special thank you to the Happy Dirt Dude and Abby for playing with us in the chat and joining us from Oklahoma and Nevada. If anyone else wants to pop in and let us know where you're joining from, that's always fun to know, because we know we have people joining us from New Zealand and Morocco and all over the world, and the Czech Republic and all throughout America and Canada and the UK. So it's just kind of fun. And even if you've been in all the sessions, there's new people in this room today who don't know where you're from. So it's just nice when you kind of play with us in the chat. So thank you for that. And on that, look, New Mexico. Awesome. Thanks, Brandon. And on that note, Lynn, welcome to this community, and thank you for coming in to share your insights and share your heart all about microbiology and pest and disease control. So welcome, welcome, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me here.
Yeah, it's so good to see you. Tell me, Lynn, when you think about pest and disease control with microbiology, um, what do you most want people to understand about that statement?
So I think our general understanding of microbiology, like we're fixated on our pathogens, our pests and disease. So when we think about microbes, we tend to think, we tend to freak out, like gross, terrible, like pathogens. I'm gonna get sick. Just because, and then most of our research on microbes is on pathogens. So that just tends to be what our general awareness is oriented around. Um, and so and then so people think they have to use antimicrobial like products in order to get rid, and like microbes are bad, so they have to get rid of all of their pathogens. But I most want to share just like a shift in that mindset and think about the pathogen within the ecosystem. And so, we live in an ecosystem of microbes. There's all kinds of microbes around us. The beneficial ones, the quiet ones, they don't get as much attention as the pathogens. And so the great thing about compost and regenerative farming and regenerative soil is that it's cultivating a lot of beneficial microbes. And so I want to kind of shift our focus towards beneficial microbes because one of the main principles in pathogen suppression is increasing your biodiversity and abundance of beneficial microorganisms. So they're going to compete with the pathogen for resources. And so there's more kind of, they can outcompete the pathogen essentially. And the biodiversity of organisms, you can have more kind of like biocontrol, we call them, organisms which are really just disease fighting, like they can release antibiotics, antifungals, and really target disease organisms. So the more that we can focus on boosting the abundance and biodiversity of our beneficial organisms, the less problems we'll see with pathogens.
Hmm, that's deep. And I guess what I mean by that is a lot of people in this room understand that and get that. A lot of people in this room are like, okay, this is what we're focusing on. And at the same time, it's new information to people to think about um, building something that's healthy. Like instead of getting rid of something, we want to build something. And by building something good, the pests and the disease are going to not want to be there anymore. Because that's what you're saying, right?
Yeah, definitely. There's something in like plant pathology, it's called like the plant disease triangle, and so it requires like three elements in order for the disease to manifest. So you do have the presence of the pathogen, but you also have a susceptible host. So a plant that's maybe not that strong, doesn't have a strong immune system, or is already weakened by something else. And the third kind of point on the triangle is a conducive environment. So something about that ecosystem itself, like, one thing we think is like for the seed starting industry, we want to sterilize our soils to get rid of the pathogens, but that could actually make it more conducive to pathogens because there's abundance of nutrients and not a lot of competition. And so it could be easier for a pathogen to take over. So that could potentially be seen as a conducive environment as well. So if you have all three of these conditions, then you have kind of a disease outbreak manifesting. So, if we want to think about not seeing that disease outbreak, then we can work on these different kind of points. So improving that plant health, its immune system, its strength to fight off disease on its own, and then the ecosystem in which, the plant, soil, and pathogen live in, so that the pathogen doesn't have a chance to take over. Yeah.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, that's really interesting because we have a lot of our speakers and even our farmers in our group will attest to other like neighboring farms having problems with pests or disease, but for some reason their farm doesn't get the pest and disease that all the other neighbors are getting. And so what I'm hearing from you is because the environment wasn't conducive. So, and that and could it be just by having those healthy plants that the pathogens are still there, the disease is still there, but because the plants are so healthy and that it's just fighting them off, that's what's happening. It can't,
Yeah,
that,
so like they're not going to get sick or they have, robust minerals. Like also mineral balancing is important. Having like a good balance of mineralogy also supports plant immune health. And the microbiology can also support that. So there's different kind of roles that are being played to support plant health, but yeah, overall, if their microbiology is good, the mineralogy is good, they're very much less likely to be susceptible to disease.
and pests, because then they don't taste good to the pests, right?
Yeah.
So tell us, so a lot of your research is based on compost and the microbiology. And so tell us what you've learned about um, making compost and having the right biology. Like what do we want to be making more of and what do we want to be making less of to make our plants healthy so that the disease wants to stay away and the pests don't want to eat our food.
I did my master's research at the University of Vermont, and we looked at using compost to suppress a fungal root rot. And this particular model species I was looking at was Rhizoctonia solani, but there's a lot of other fungal root rots too, and there's fungal like foliar diseases as well. And we tested like a variety of composts from around the region that was being produced by compost makers around the region. So the ones that were most suppressive was like a worm compost from like pre-composted like dairy manure. So I'd gone through the hot process and then was matured through worms. The worm compost extract was also very suppressive. And then there's previous research on using hardwood bark as a feedstock material for compost that supports more disease suppression. So we had some of that made as well. And that was also, in terms of the pile compost, like that was the most suppressive and the only one that really had this hardwood bark feedstock. And we looked at microbiology and generally like the fungal kind of abundances were a little bit higher in the worm compost and the hardwood bark compost. So I think there is some relationship there to greater abundance and biodiversity of fungi that supports disease suppression, and they have many other benefits to the soil as well. So that's one thing from my graduate work, and also the method of making extract as opposed to tea. So I think this is just one way people distinguish between actively aerated compost tea with like an air bubbler versus like a passive steeping of the compost in water. That would be, we would call extract. So there's also research that shows there's greater biodiversity in that compost extract as opposed to the actively aerated compost tea because that active aeration is selecting for certain microbial groups, like particularly bacteria and protozoa. And so the extract is also a little bit less kind of disruptive to the ecosystem. And so it's preserving more of that compost microbiology in there as well. So, having a good like hot compost, that's aged well. That's another thing we looked at is the maturity age. So really good maturation is also really important for disease suppression. Um, and that's partly because some of these biocontrol organisms will recolonize the pile during that maturation phase. And so we want to give them that time to get established. Also, there's one that people know about, which is trichoderma, and that has gotten really popular. And some research is looking at like, oh, specific species and strains of microbes. Like, let's just add those specific groups of microbes. And that can be helpful. But I've also heard stories about farmers who are just, loading trichoderma into their fields, and then the trichoderma kind of takes over and outcompetes like their kind of native microbiology or other beneficial microbiology. So I always think it's important to work with communities of microbes. And, I try to work more with the compost process to cultivate good microbiology as opposed to taking isolated strains, just because you also don't want these, even if they're pathogen fighting, to dominate your soil microbial ecosystem.
And what are some of the techniques? I mean, you kind of mentioned a thermal compost, but really, what are some of the practices in making really good compost that amplifies a, creating a disease-resistant environment?
Yeah, so, having your good carbon feedstock materials, like if you can get like a bark material, I also did look at some sheet mulch soil, and there was a mulch that was mostly just bark, and that had much better like water retention
Mm.
and aggregate stability. So there's something about bark, it's like the living skin of the tree. So that's where you're going to have the most kind of microbial abundance and diversity. Like the role of the bark is to protect the tree from pathogens. So it makes sense that using bark in your compost is also going to impart that kind of unique microbiology that's already been developed to protect against pathogens. So using that in your carbon mix, I generally am shooting for like kind of a 3 to 2 browns to greens, or like, a 30 to 1 kind of C to N ratio. So like a little bit extra carbon, not necessarily like so much, but a little bit more on the carbon heavy side. And having a good mix of your food scraps, and I always want to include manure, has a really good microbiology in there as well. So I think mostly having like a good carbon source and including like bark in that recipe is really good. Going through a good hot cycle is really important too. And there was a compost maker who I did like a microscope assessment for. And she, typically does a hot compost process, but there was like a mushroom company that was closing down and they were getting rid of all of their spent mushroom blocks. And a bunch of them had been sitting around for a while, but she was going to go pick them up and put them into her compost pile. And they already kind of said they've been sitting around for a while. They might be kind of anaerobic. And so she already kind of knew, like, maybe there could be pathogens in there. But I think because she maybe wanted to preserve the fungi, she didn't put it through a hot compost process. And so I looked at that under the microscope and compared it to just her regular recipe. And there were more like potentially like pathogenic spores in her like non-hot compost recipe. So I mentioned that to her and she, shared that she didn't do the hot compost. So she adjusted her recipe based on that assessment. And so she, is going to put that material through the hot compost because it has probably cultivated some pathogens already and just continue to age it as she would normally. So that was how like that assessment was able to help her make adjustments to her recipe and help to reduce, pathogens in her recipe. And so, that good carbon, that hot temperature, like 130 to 160 degrees, and then a good maturation time, probably at least 1 to 3 months. And it's not necessarily like you want it to sit for years and years. There's a good kind of window of opportunity where that compost is biologically rich and active. So probably within like 6 months, to 10 months or so, you want to be able to use that compost. Yeah.
Those are some cool tips. So bark, how much bark do we need to inoculate a compost pile?
Typically, I mean, I think we just used about like 10 or 15% bark. So that's probably a good place to start. Yeah.
Mhm. And do you know, did you do any testing to use less than that? Because what if I'm making a big compost pile and I don't have that kind of bark available?
Yeah, I know it can be hard to source a lot of bark. So, if you have to use less, like that's fine. Yeah.
Yeah. Would you agree that the science would tell us that even using a small amount of bark would inoculate the compost pile? Maybe not as much as if you were using 10 to 15%, but would it be enough? Like if I could get a handful or two handfuls of bark to inoculate, a big like mound of compost, would that be
I think it
sufficient?
would definitely be helpful if, all of your other recipe and process is good. That's going to definitely help inoculate. You can also, add inoculants or mix in kind of inoculants to your, mature compost. So you
Mm.
could mix in some bark with your mature compost and kind of screen it out when you're ready to use it. So that's also like I put some bark like in my worm bin just to inoculate the worm bin. So that's also an option. I think just in principle, like any of your feedstock materials, yeah, like that microbiology is kind of like what you're introducing into your compost pile. So even if it's just a little bit of bark, like that's still helpful. That's still more helpful than not adding any.
Yeah. And what other substances did you test and find success with?
Um, so we were trying to see if like other feedstock materials were contributing to the disease suppression, but it was a little bit hard to tell. Like we weren't able to necessarily find like statistical significance. So it was really just like the worm compost and the bark. So worm compost also, like if you can mix. But also, it's like that was like a pretty nice process. Like went through the hot compost process first, and it was really just like a dairy manure silage kind of blend.
Mhm.
So that went through a hot compost process and then was like matured through worms. And so ideally you would try to do that kind of a process, like the
Mm.
hot compost and then the worms, because that
Mhm.
helps to, the heat helps to kill off pathogens to begin
Yeah.
with. And then the worms inoculate with their unique kind of gut microbiology. And so that really kind of boosts the compost in terms of like microbes and the nutrients and everything. So like a good worm compost is also something good to add if you're trying to make a compost extract to fight disease or like a top dress. Making sure you include worm compost in your soil blend is also going to be really helpful.
Okay. Um, and when you say so hot compost, then the static, longer standing compost, are you saying to and one thing I heard you say, I might have misheard you, was to finish it off with worms. So are you doing a Johnson Sue style, or are you just letting like the worms come up from the underneath the compost and help and do their thing on the earth, or did I misunderstand?
Yeah, so oftentimes the worms will just come up. I think it's, like that could work. I think it's still good to maybe have a more formal, like worm composting process just to make you know that you are having the worms, work through all of your material. So, one system I've played with is there's like a small continuous flow through worm bin that some community composters created. And so we can feed our mature compost through a system like that. I also am trying to work with some worm piles. I went to visit the Arizona worm farm. They have really cool like worm wedges and worm piles. And so my idea around that is it's more of a horizontal migration. So you're feeding your maturing compost like on one side and then, inoculating with worms and then kind of feeding like, horizontally and then the worms kind of travel that way and then you can kind of harvest the material that they've left behind and then kind of go back and forth in your feeding and movement of the worms.
Mhm.
Um, so those are some different options for just worm compost processing. And they do need like, more shade. Well, for us in our climate, things tend to be dry, so we're always wanting to put our worms in shade, but basically maintaining like an optimal moisture for them. And I think they do like a lot of moisture to be like 60%, 70% moisture. So just trying to maintain that, but also not too much. So if you're in a place that gets a lot of precipitation or humidity, like maybe you have to be careful about, making sure it doesn't get too moist. Um, and so letting it work through the worms for at least like a month or so, and that will help ensure that it's really been kind of worked through by the worms. Yeah.
Mhm. It's like making a super compost.
Yes. But yeah, Johnson Stew is supposed to be really good for making high fungal compost. And yeah, it is like a high fungal worm compost system. And it is designed to be like passive aeration, so you don't have to disrupt that compost kind of matrix so much.
Mhm.
Um, I haven't personally like worked with it so much, but I hear a lot of people have like really great benefits with it. Just the general principles of like encouraging more fungi in the soil is to like not turn it so much. So then you do need like some passive aeration systems, like maybe larger chunks of wood chips or, putting in some like aeration pipes, aeration tubes,
Mhm.
maintaining that moisture. So it's kind of a more passive means of maintaining moisture and aeration while allowing it to have a pretty good maturation time. Yeah.
Mhm. Cool. And Lynn, when you're looking for pathogens in the compost, and this is a question from Happy Dirt Dude, how many types are you looking for, and what are some of the major ones?
Some of the major ones, so some of the fungal spores, and this is like with any kind of microscope, like the microscope has its benefits and its limitations. So it's like super precise identification of species. You generally need like, additional types of information, like mycologists use the spore structure, but also they need to know other, aspects of the mushroom structure. So we are kind of you know, judging based on just what we're seeing, which in this case typically is just like the spore structure. So it's like a potential, pathogen. So one of the ones we saw was, I think it was like a turfgrass pathogen. It was called like leptosphaeria. And so that was one that we saw in that mushroom compost. And other ones that you might see are, like fungal root rot pathogens, like the Rhizoctonia or Phytophthora. And there's also foliar pathogens. You might see that just on the leaves themselves, like Alternaria. There's also a bacterial pathogen that's spiral shaped. I'm not sure if I've actually seen that in the samples I've looked at under the microscope, but so it really just shows up in very anaerobic soil. So that's something to look out for. It's kind of clear and spiral shaped, and there's some nuances in their morphology, like they could be tightly coiled and long, or they could be short and just like little waves. And so that's like kind of a major pathogen to be concerned about. So it's probably, yeah, it's like a sign that something is off in your soil or compost. And so you want to like make adjustments to it to mitigate seeing those populations.
Mhm. And so adding the bark is something that we can do to really help with disease resistance. And what are some of the things you notice that we can help with pest resistance?
Um, so with pests, I tend to use more kind of landscape level, like looking at design, like certain types of flowers or herbs are going to trap or deter pests from coming through. So kind of integrating some more of these pest like trap plants or repellent plants into kind of the farm system can be helpful. I have also used the compost extract on things like aphids and other pests, and it really does, drastically reduce their populations. Did have to kind of reapply it, every week or two to kind of keep those populations down. Um, so those are like a couple strategies. And then there's also research that has shown that just like compost application just around the like plant like a top dress, just that biodiversity will also help reduce pest populations as well. So those are some of the different types of treatments. Also, just improving your plant health overall, just optimizing that mineral balance and microbiology, and will improve the plant's immune system so it not be as susceptible to pests kind of grazing on them. So those are some of the different tools that I'll use to mitigate pests. Yeah.
And how are you using the compost and the compost extracts to mitigate the disease and the pests? How often are you making the applications? And how often are you making the applications? And then also, um, is it something that's seasonal? Is it something you have to do every year, or can you use it less and less and less as time goes by?
Yeah. So the compost extract, maybe is like 5% compost in like a mesh bag, and in your container of choice. I just fill it with water. Sometimes I will add some like microbial inoculants. I was playing around with something called EM1. A lot of people were recommending it, so I just wanted to try it out. But you don't have to add anything really. Like that quality of your compost extract is really just dependent on the quality of your compost. So if that's really good, then you should be good. So I'll throw that into a sprayer and to spray the affected plants, and make sure they get a couple good coats, and that's been pretty effective. I've used this for other diseased plants as well who, I don't know, there was maybe some poison. This was spread, and like this was in somebody's like landscape, and they had their plants, part of it was like dying off. We kind of applied compost and biochar and mycorrhizae like to like the soil at the bottom. And then we also did compost extract treatments. And it started coming back. Some of the dead, like woody material, we had to prune off. But that same plant, started growing new leaves. And, so it's coming back from like a really harsh, like some sort of chemical treatment.
Mhm.
So in terms of like for pest management, so there's like different tools here. So thinking about just the design and management in general of the plants, if you can optimize those, like, I mean, sometimes we've let the seedlings sit in their trays for too long and then they become susceptible to pests. So there's like different, just you want to take care of your plants well, like those are kind of the first steps to do is like make sure you're putting them into the ground when they're ready and you're caring for the plants properly so they can take care of themselves. And then if you really do need to fight off pests, then, once a week, if it's really bad pest pressure, to do the compost extract application. If it starts going down, then you can cut that back to every 2 weeks or less. And so you can just kind of monitor based on that pest pressure. It doesn't necessarily work for every single pest, but for a lot of them, it will work really well. So yeah, so that would be the general idea.
And that's really curious because it sounds like as long as you've got a really good compost, you can use that compost for disease and pests. You don't have to necessarily make a special compost for disease and special compost for pests, but just a really good compost is going to nourish our plants and our soil in the way that it needs to be nourished to fight off those pests and diseases.
Yeah, I mean, it's easier just to make a really nice compost and just use that for everything. If you do, have to make different grades or qualities of compost, I mean, you could just make like a one small batch of really nice compost that is just targeted for pest and disease suppression. If that's like it takes you more time to make that and it takes less time to just make your general kind of soil amendment compost. Then you could separate it out. I mean, for me, I just like to make the best compost I can. And yeah, sometimes I do need to make like, just a more broad application kind of pile, or I just need to make bulk soil. So maybe I won't, be as particular about that compost. So yeah, that's also possible that you want to different piles. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the biggest mistakes you see people make with making their compost and that it's going to be making a good compost tea extract to put on their soil and on their plants and not hurt them?
Um, yeah, so well, a lot of the like ideas or practices that I've seen out here is like people just use their compost like really quickly, like before it's like fully mature. Like people, maybe don't understand or don't want to wait for their compost to mature. Or they just want to spread it. So that's a really common thing that I see is like once it's like semi-cool and they don't see the food waste, they just want to spread it right away. But at that point, there could still be a lot of variability in that compost. So it still is really important to wait and let it mature for longer. Then there was a farmer friend I had who I shared this with, and I don't know, he was stubborn in his ways, so he didn't want to do that, and he's just doing his thing. He's just gonna use it like when it's kind of cool, like just starting to cool down. And it was because he had to kind of move to a new site, and there was just like major change in his life, and he was moving all the compost that he made to the new site, and it just so happened that it got to age for like a year, and he started using that material. And he called me recently and was like, you know what, you were right. Like, I was never going to listen to you or follow what you said. And it was only because like this had to age, because it was forced to age, that I can see the difference, that the plants are growing much better. There's less problems. So now I'm a believer.
Oh, cool. Wow. And so aging is really important. What's the minimum amount of time in your experience and in your research that you noticed a person would want to let a compost pile age?
Yeah, so once it's cooled down to ambient, like maybe 60 degrees, and that, like sometimes it's really hot out, and so like sometimes it's 80 degrees out, and then your compost is 80 degrees. So I would want to age it at least 1 month. You want to let it sit for that long. If you can, let it sit for another 2 months, maybe 3 months. Like I think that's even better. But I would just, I know people don't want to wait, so I'll just say like at least 1 month.
Yeah, that's good. And I mean, it feels like a long time, but it's really actually not that long
Yeah,
when you
it's
think
not that
about
long.
the different product that you're getting, right? It's the difference between night and day. There's a couple of questions here, Lynn. One is, did you notice any differences between making compost in Vermont versus California because of the climate difference?
Yeah, there's various differences. Of course, like the moisture is one of the biggest differences. So get a lot of precipitation in Vermont. There's snow. People are still composting in the snow. As long as your food scraps don't freeze, I guess that's one of the trickier things in cold climates is your food scraps and feedstock materials freezing up. But if it's in the hot compost pile, like, it's still hot. Like that heat is generated from inside the pile. So it can melt the snow off of the compost pile outside of it. So it's still going. So it's easier to maintain moisture. You might have too much moisture, so that's more of a challenge to manage in New England. I went to visit some compost sites in New York, and they make their piles with like a really pointed tip in this cone shape. And that's because they want that moisture to shed off of the pile instead of like accumulating in there because there's too much moisture. So over here, our biggest problem is they dry out really quickly. So we try to put irrigation on them, like compost blankets or covers or tarps, shade structures over our compost piles, and just have to really maintain moisture. That's one of the biggest challenges out here. So we always need to try to think about putting our compost piles in shady areas. We're like creating shade for them. Um, so yeah, that's one of the biggest differences. And then I guess like some of the feedstock materials could be a little bit different. But I would say there's quite an abundance of manure like in both Vermont and California, which is nice. Um, and the other thing about Vermont, like living in Burlington, they were using like a wood burning like that was like their energy source for the city. So there's actually quite a lot of competition for wood chips and bark and things like that. So you'd have to buy some of these materials, whereas that's not the case in California. It's kind of like a lot of the tree trimmers. Also, I'm in a more urban area, so a lot of the tree trimmers. Their conventional practice is to just take those wood chips to the dump and they have to pay for that. So we are kind of reclaiming that from the landfill here. So it's more of a free and abundant resource out here. So those are some of the differences. Yeah.
Mhm. And you mentioned integrating biochar and minerals in with the compost and compost extracts. And I'm just wondering, how important is that in mitigating pests and disease?
I have just started to experiment with biochar, and it does seem very promising because the idea of biochar is that it's burned out all of its organic matter. It's kind of an empty matrix, like an empty sponge, like a dry sponge.
Mhm.
So it's ready to suck things in, essentially. And so that's why you have to kind of pre-inoculate with compost. So you fill it up with compost, microbes, nutrients, water, and then it becomes like a storage house, and you've increased the storage capacity in your soil blend, and it can be a source of nutrients and water and microbes. So I think in my experience, I've tested compost and biochar, And plants do seem to grow better in the compost biochar blend. Like they're bigger, more vigorous, more green. So the biochar is kind of like almost like extending the mileage on your compost. It's like enhancing like your microbial habitat so it can facilitate more disease suppression in that way, by providing just like more microbial habitat. And on the other hand, like we think about using biochar, people are also using biochar in like biofiltration of like water and stormwater runoff. And because it's an empty sponge, it can hold on to contaminants, it can sequester extra nutrients if you have like too much nutrient runoff coming from your site, or like, it can be good for leachate management. It can kind of just hold on to, yeah, excess nutrients and contaminants. So
Mm.
it could be used in that way as well.
Yep, that's so fascinating to me. I don't know if there's any scuba divers in the room, but one of my favorite dives was off the coast of Australia. It's called the Yongala, if you're a scuba diver, and it's one of the top 7 dives, or I think, or 11 dives in the world to do. And what's interesting and fascinating about that dive is it's a wreck dive. So it's a big kind of ship of some kind that went down in the middle of this strait. And what's unique about it is this strait is like it's all just wide open sand. So there's no coral reefs, there's nothing of the cool stuff that people go diving all over Australia for. But this ship that went down in the middle created it reminds me of biochar because it created this safe haven and this place for all the sea life to come to. And what's really unique about the Yongala is the sea life there is way bigger than anywhere else on the coast or in Australia or maybe even in the world because there's no predators. And so you have like angelfish, which are like, I'm not kidding you, they're like massive. And you've got like sea turtles and you've got all these and the fish aren't scared of you either because usually when you're just going scuba diving, you're scuba diving along and the fish will like they'll kind of move away from you. They'll kind of play with you. It depends. But in this particular dive, you were literally like diving and looking around and in the schools of fish. Like they're just like, hi, like you're totally like one of them. They're not scared of anything until the hammerhead shark came. And I'm not kidding you. I was diving and I was in this big school of fish, and all of a sudden the whole school of fish went like this, whoom. And I was like, and I actually screamed because I didn't know what was happening. And then this big hammerhead shark, I'm not kidding you, I could have put my hand out and touched. I was going like this, so I didn't go into it because it was a current dive, so it was in the current, and I was like this. So, anyways, I share this long story because I've been talking a lot about biochar, and every single time I think about biochar, I think about this dive and this ship that came into this strait and provided this safe haven for all this sea life to live and to flourish. And that's the image and the energy that I feel with this biochar being introduced into the soils it's like a party for the microbes, right? The party for the microbes for a safe haven when they need to be protective and also a place where they can flourish when they need to flourish given the right environment. So very powerful. Does that make sense to you as a scientist?
Yeah, it's like a structure, like, you built new houses for your microbes. Like it's like for us, like it's like somebody just dropped in like a whole neighborhood with like houses and people can just like move in and have like a place to stay. So yeah, that's kind of a good way to think about it.
Yeah, it's amazing. And to think about the biochar being that in the soil for the microbes and for the soil life is quite like it kind of blows my mind out. Like um and the session on biochar is with Laura Decker of Microbiometer, who's one of the sponsors of the Soil Summit, and Lori Mann, who is a biochar lover. So I'm going to go back into the questions. Chris asks, what do you think about sheet composting? And I'll let you answer that first. Have you done sheet composting? You're familiar with it?
I've done like sheet mulching, like lasagna mulching, and I mean we do like a layer method with the composting. I'm not sure if that's like the method that you're referring to.
Maybe let us know, Chris. And
Um,
then go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say, like with my understanding, well, for the layer of composting, like that's the same, you get the same result as if you kind of mix it up together. With sheet mulching, like we're kind of layering, like for us, we're working with like lawns and trying to transform lawns into farms or native plant habitat. And so we will like layer down cardboard and a little bit of nitrogen, like a high nitrogen compost or a manure, and then wood chips on top, and then kind of water that in really well, and then that will rot and decompose the grass and then build soil. And it works really well for putting in native plants. They do really well. Or, if you want to put in a farm, we add like some more compost on top and then kind of grow vegetables in that material, and it works really well.
Awesome. Thank you for that. And if you get manure from non-grass conventional dairy farms, do the animal medicines break down in the hot compost?
That's a really good question. I think some of them will break down in the hot compost. I don't know if it's like 100%. This is my understanding of various compounds in compost. Like pesticides or pharmaceuticals is like some of them will break down 100%, and then some of them like are a little bit more resistant. So I would say you could estimate like maybe 50% breakdown for like one compost cycle. Um so yeah, I think it's good if you're concerned. Like I think it's always good to ask like your manure source, like, what are you feeding the animals? Like what kinds of medications are you giving them? Like we didn't take a manure from a horse hospital because we were concerned about like just the medications that were in there. We just weren't sure. Um, I do know like for horses, like dewormers are really popular, and I did read that that breaks down under the sun in like 3 weeks. So like just having like a little bit of age in your horse manure would be fine for compost.
Mhm. Thanks for that. And Lynn, have you done much work using the bricks readings from plant sap? And if you have, what are your reflections on that, on how healthy, like what does that indicate about a plant's health based on its Brix level? And Greg says that his experience shows that plant sap Brix above 12 seems to provide self-induced plant protection against disease and pest attacks. So have you tested that at all or noticed?
I haven't done too much of it personally, but I have learned from people who have used them, and that is what I have heard from them is that yeah, if your Brix level is very high, then the plant itself is like very resilient against pests and disease, and you can bring that level up through the mineral balancing and kind of microbial application, like with the compost application. Um, so that's what I understand about that. We did participate in a study. I think it was run by the Bionutrient Food Association. So
Mhm.
they were using the Brix refractometer. So we sent in samples from a local community farm where we were making compost and growing food. And it was, because we were making good compost. So it was growing food really well and very productive. And so we sent in some vegetable samples, and they were trying to compare like soil health and plant nutrient density. And so we tested very high for all of those indicators. Your plant nutrient density was like top 99 percentile or something like that. So it's very high in like antioxidants and polyphenols. And so all of those things will be protecting the plant from pests and disease.
It's just amazing, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think more and more farmers are really getting this concept. I think gardeners are like, yeah, but I just want to get rid of my aphids. But yeah, I think it might be even harder for gardeners sometimes because there's that less diversity, in what they're growing, right? So that makes them more vulnerable to
Yeah, I
Maybe that
think
help you,
it's,
sorry.
kind of a design question, like,
Hmm.
how do you design it so you can maybe integrate some, I don't know, maybe you could just have a flower hedge, or if you have a large space, you could, do like a flower hedge. If you have a small space, you put like flowers at the end, like at the edge of each row, or like maybe the middle, depending on how long it is. So just try to plop them in there, here and there if you can.
Hmm. This is going back to the composting question and the antibiotics and stuff like that, and the in the cattle and the manure. And Chris was just saying he's worried that some animal chemicals may kill dung beetles and I guess other beneficial things. So, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, that is like a big concern, and I don't know if there's like a great solution for that. I think one thing you could do is maybe not use too much manure in your compost blend, like, or if you're worried about introducing any of that manure, then maybe that's not something you want to take in at your site. And it's like, you have to look for kind of good sources of manure. Um, so you may have to look for a different source, or you could just try to use very little of that manure. And it's unfortunate because like that material is so abundant.
Mhm.
Um, and it's just speaks to like we need like kind of like a systems level change in like how we're caring for and raising our animals and managing the manure. So like what why are we introducing so many chemicals like into our animals, into our food system, and that ends up in the manure, in the compost. And I think compost can get flack for some of these, you know, contaminated materials that we use. Like there was a lot of, attention on PFAS a few years ago because it was in like compostable foodware, but it's in like everything, and it accumulates in compost piles. And so I don't know if I feel like there was a sentiment of like, oh, like compost is bad because it's high in PFAS, but why do we have so much PFAS, all around? Like, can we find a better like substance to use? We want to create like, grease resistant, water resistant materials. Like, why does it have to be like such a toxic material? So it's like these things that this like we find these things in our waste stream, and then it's not like it shows up there, but it's not because of the waste management process that's necessarily a problem, but like, it's like an upstream problem. So yeah, it's really engaging kind of like whole systems level thinking, and we would ideally want to be working with these manufacturers and producers to mitigate the amount of like toxic substances that they're using, and that's like the difficult thing to do. Yeah.
Mhm, mhm. Um, some 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 people really believe that with the right fungi in the right hitting the right temperatures in the compost piles, that we can actually like a lot of those bad things from their in manure that's coming from animals that have been treated is actually getting like burnt up and eaten up, and how do you transformed in the compost pile. Have
Yeah.
you looked into that or researched that at all, or?
I have read about this. There are a lot of contaminants that can be broken down in compost. A lot of the microbes, and especially fungi, they can really learn to break down contaminants. You could train like oyster mycelium to eat up a cigarette butt, and it's
Mhm.
basically transforming that into mycelium, into its fungal body. So it's really breaking down the pollutant and turning it into mushroom essentially. And so it can do that. You can train it to do that for a lot of contaminants, or you could isolate species that are growing in contaminated areas, and they'll have adapted to break down those substances. And so, like, honestly, most pollutants can be broken down by fungi or compost microbes. It might take time, like, it might not happen in the first cycle or the first couple months. like it might not be 100%. And the only thing they can't really break down is like heavy metals. So the heavy metals are an element. And so, but fungi can accumulate heavy metals in their body, so they can sequester it. So one of the principles in dealing with heavy metals is like sequestering it so it's not bioavailable, it doesn't go up into your plants and the food in your body, but and then you do have to like remove it. So like one method is like inoculating straw wattles with mycelium. You could put that in soil or like in contaminated waterways, and it will filter out all of the heavy metals and contaminants. And you have to remove that straw wattle because now that is contaminated. And there's honestly not like a great hazardous waste option for those materials right now that I'm aware of. So I don't know, we end up putting them like in the landfill, and then a lot of toxic materials go into the landfill. But ideally, there would be a better way to deal with that, or a better way to sequester that somewhere so it's not causing harm in the environment. And same thing with compost, the microbes and the organic matter complexes can bind heavy metals. So you'll see like plants in metals contaminated soils. If there's compost added, they're taking up a lot less metals into their leaves and shoot structures. So compost is also able to help sequester metals. And when we're thinking about cleaning up contaminants, there's like different strategies to use, whether it's like pulling it out, degrading it, or sequestering it. So like planning these types of projects, you want to be thoughtful about like which process you're using. Like if you're trying to pull it out, then you don't want to sequester it. So you want to pull it out and then do your sequestration technique.
Mhm. Yeah, because sometimes it's really hard to get animals that have not been treated with antibiotics um or other things. So if you're in a situation where you can't where the animal products that you can get, have been treated, then what I'm hearing is to make sure you're getting your compost pile like thermogenic hot at least once, and to make sure there's good fungal in there to be eating things up, and then to leave it mature, like give it a longer maturation rate. So like absolute minimum 1 month, more favorably, maybe 3 or 6 months.
Yeah, definitely. Like those are your best practices to ensure like, the cleanest compost and ensure like as much just like antibiotic or pollutant breakdown in that compost.
Mhm. And when I know you also teach people how to make compost. You've got some really awesome courses. And when you're, without like giving your whole course away, of course you can't do that in 2 minutes. But I'm curious, when you're teaching people how to make compost, what do you feel like are the most important principles to understand?
Um, so I mentioned like the feedstocks, and so yeah, balancing that is, and then getting into the hot temperature. So balancing your C to N ratio is really going to drive your good thermophilic temperature, and making sure you have good moisture and aeration. So generally trying to hit like a 50 to 60% moisture content is good. Including some bulky items in there like the wood chips or plant stalks. I don't know, we might have like stone fruit pits or like oyster shells in there, like that are a little bit more resistant to degradation. Those are good because they're going to help, create little air pockets in your compost. And so you can have good like oxygen content in there. And that's really going to feed your good like aerobic decomposer microorganisms and ensure that you have a good aerobic composting process. And also that, you're gonna mitigate any odor problems because once if you have just like sawdust and food waste and it's wet, it's compact, there's not gonna be good airflow, it's gonna get smelly, it's gonna go anaerobic. So that's a really important thing is your kind of particle size distribution. But you don't want to just have bulky items either because then you'll have too much airflow, it would dry out, and that when it dries out, it's going to stop that decomposition process. Um, And so you want to have a good mix. Like you do want your sawdust and food waste, but you also want like wood chips and like some manure and some plant trimmings. And so the fine particles are cool because they have a larger like surface area to volume ratio. So they'll get colonized more quickly and easily by microbes, and they can kind of decompose more quickly. So you do need that as like your food source to drive the decomposition as well. Um, yeah.
And what is there anything in particular about pest and disease um, mitigation slash control slash understanding and microbiology that we haven't touched on today, Lynn, that you really want to make sure that we address?
Yeah, so I mean, compost is incredible and compost extract is incredible. And I would love to say that it works for every single problem, and it's not necessarily true. Like it works for a lot of problems, but it's also not necessarily 100%. So you can rely on it for a lot of challenges that you come across. But as I mentioned, just good plant care, good design and management, just logistics, all of that is also really important, just to managing your farm health. And there may be other things that you need to use to deal with your pest issues. Like, we use like BT for like cabbage looper moths and things like that. So some people will use like neem oil. But it's good to not rely too much on those things. So I think for things like neem oil, like I think it would be good to use compost extract instead, and then only rely on, something that's more antimicrobial for like really critical times where you like really need to use that. So I think just experimenting, learning. There's a lot of different insects out there. There's plants that will attract predatory insects. So kind of trying to integrate more of those plants in too, along with your trap plants. I think all of that is really helpful.
Mm, Such good insights, Lynn. Thank you so much for your time. I'm just seeing some things come into the chat. People are really grateful. Do you use the Johnson Sioux type composter?
I haven't necessarily used it myself. I did do a demonstration. We did build a demo system at one of the colleges that I teach at, and I don't think, unfortunately, the budget was cut from that garden, so they weren't able to maintain it. But we did do like a demonstration setup of that system. So we didn't necessarily get to maintain it for that long, but we just did some small demonstrations. I think it's a really cool idea. I think it's maybe a lot of like materials and infrastructure. So I personally am wanting to experiment with, I'm just a fan of piles. So I want to experiment with more pile-based like systems for creating more high fungal worm compost. And so that might include some aeration tubes. It might include, a platform like a pallet or something underneath. There's also other techniques we thought about using, like using logs or branches under the base to maintain like aeration. And so yeah, so that's more I'm like to experiment with ideas that like work in our spaces more. And I would encourage people to do that too. I like to think about the ecological principles. So for fungi, it is like, maintaining that passive aeration and maintaining moisture. So thinking about designing a system that can optimize those things that works for your situation is how I would try to go about it. Yeah.
I love how you amplified that. It's such a beautiful way to wrap your session is really understanding a system that's going to work for you, not just a composting system, also a farm system, a garden system, because the composting and the compost tea extracts, like you said, Lynn, are just a part of the solution of the whole of the ecosystem. So I think that it was so beautifully and eloquently shared with us today through your insights and experience. So thank you so much for your time and your heart that you shared with us. And I love the stories. I love the examples because it helps gives us context to what we're learning about. So thanks for that too, Lynn. And to find Lynn on the World Wide Web, you can go to soilwise.earth. And on Facebook, you can find her at Lynn Fang 22. That's LYNNFANG 22. So Lynn Fang 22. On Instagram at soilwise.earth and also at L_Fang. And Lynn also teaches composting courses, and they're really affordably priced. And she's got good experience. She's offering a 10% discount on her composting courses from now until the 15th. Very special offer for the Soil Summit. And you can go to the 131school.com/collections to take advantage of that. And you can use the code HEARTSOILWISE. That's for 10% discount at the 131school.com/collections. So thank you so much for joining us here at the Soil Summit, Revive Your Soil, Grow More with Less. We deeply appreciate you and we love you. And we are standing with you as we learn and grow together individually and collectively. Thank you. And we have gifts to give away, don't we,
And
Leslie?
we have one more question.
Tell
Gail
me.
has compost piles, but a problem with rats. Lynn, do you have
Oh,
suggestions?
Um, yeah, rats are can be kind of tricky. I think if you have a really good hot compost pile, they won't really go in there. It depends. Like if there's just like a lot of rats around, then it's more likely that they'll get in there. If so the other thing is like good management of your feedstock materials. So any food, don't leave any food waste exposed, make sure it's covered up with wood chips. And if you need like more security around your pile, like, maybe covering it up with a tarp or a blanket and kind of securing that down. People who use like the bin systems, they generally have to make sure there's like no holes in their bin systems, and it's kind of just chasing after the rat holes and, you know, sealing up any like little entrance points that they could get in. And then making sure, yeah, that your food scraps are sealed. I guess one of the challenges with bin systems is that they will they potentially the way you build them, like you could have food waste like exposed on the sides. And so you want to make sure like you're still covering up your food waste like on the edges too. So those are things that will help. The other thing is like just kind of ecosystem level, like, trying to introduce predators. Some people use these like little like patches. It's like synthetic coyote pee to try to scare off like these small pests. So there's other like little tools you can use to try to, mitigate rats as well, or just, having to trap them and move them, relocate them somewhere else might be part of that strategy also. Yeah, one thing I wanted to share about the 131 school is that's yeah, so I am doing a microbial assessment course there, and it's using the microscope and understanding like all the roles of the microbial ecology, the different microorganisms that are important to your compost, and how to kind of use your microscope to assess that good microbiology in your compost and soil so that you can make adjustments to your process, whether it's compost making or farming, to really just optimize the beneficial microbes and just the power of your microbiology to provide all of the benefits that we mentioned. So yeah, that's on the 131 School of Compost platform, and my colleague James McSweeney founded that platform, and he's also doing like a compost operator training there. So yeah, feel free to check out those courses.
awesome. Thanks for clarifying that and reminding me of that, Lynn. I'm so sorry that I misspoke it.
Oh yeah, no worries. Thank you guys for having me here. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And you make yourself an amazing day. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you all.
You're welcome to stay on while we give these prizes away, Lynn, or you can hop off, like whatever works for you.
Thank you so much, Lynn. Just fascinating. And I've got work to do in my yard.
Yeah, and I just want to give a shout out because I misspoke her composting course because it's soil microbiology, and the price for her this is really affordable, like $400 and $350. So if you're wanting like an entry level course to go into, just learn how to use the microscope and identify the things that are going on in your compost pile and in your compost tea extracts and stuff like that, it's a great starting place. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, I'm gonna hop off and
Okay.
have a great day.
Thanks so
you
much.
too. Ciao.
And yes, replays are available. So replays from today will be posted tomorrow, by tomorrow on the free watch page if you're a free access pass holder. And you have unlimited replays and unlimited times if you're an all access pass holder. There's a course login, and though these sessions will remain available to you. Apparently in the last session, I learned we had a problem with our link. So the correct link is in here now. So I'm sorry about that.